A brilliant chemist in the 1960s who refuses to let a male-dominated society compromise her intellect, eventually transforming a cooking show into a revolution for women. Lessons in Chemistry. A Paradigm of Reaction. Chapter 1. The Alchemy of Resistance. The laboratory at the Hastings Research Institute smelled of sulfur, old paper, and the suffocating musk of male condescension. It was 1961, and Elizabeth Zott was the only female chemist in the building. To her colleagues, she was either an anomaly to be ignored or a secretary who had somehow misplaced her typewriter. Elizabeth did not care for their opinions. To her, chemistry was the ultimate truth. It was the study of change, how elements bound together, clashed, and transformed into something entirely new. Zott, drive, Myers called out, leaning against her immaculate workstation. The coffee in the break room is empty. Be a dear and brew a fresh pot, will you? Elizabeth didn't look up from her barrette. She carefully measured a solution of hydrochloric acid, her hand steady. Dr. Myers, you have a PhD in biochemistry. I am confident you can deduce the ratio of coffee grounds to boiling water without my assistance. If not, I can write down the chemical formula for caffeine extraction for you. Myers scoffed, muttering something about unprovoked hostility, before walking away. Elizabeth sighed. This was her daily gauntlet. She was working on a groundbreaking research project regarding abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-living matter. Her theories on RNA synthesis were revolutionary, but because she lacked a Y chromosome, her funding was constantly threatened, and her papers were routinely rejected by journals that didn't even bother to read past her first name. Later that evening, as the lab emptied, Elizabeth remained. The quiet of the night was when she did her best work. She was adjusting a reflux condenser when the door opened. It was Calvin Evans. Calvin was the Institute's golden boy. A brilliant, eccentric, and notoriously antisocial chemist, he was Hastings' main source of prestige. He was a man who lived in his own head, often forgetting to eat or wear matching socks, but his mind was an unyielding furnace of scientific genius. He stopped, surprised to see someone else. You're using the high vacuum line, he noted, his voice flat but curious. I am, Elizabeth said, bracing for another lecture. And I am using it correctly, before you ask. Calvin walked over, staring at her notes. Elizabeth watched him closely, ready to defend her thesis. He read through her complex equations, his eyes moving rapidly. He didn't smirk. He didn't make a comment about her appearance. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. Your approach to the nucleotide bonds, it's completely unorthodox. But the thermodynamics check out. Why haven't you published this? Because the board thinks my uterus interferes with my ability to understand molecular biology, Elizabeth said bluntly. Calvin blinked, genuinely perplexed. That's statistically and biologically absurd. Gender has no bearing on covalent bonds. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt a spark of genuine connection. Someone finally saw her for what she was, a chemist. Chapter 2. The Catalyst of Connection. The bond between Elizabeth Zott and Calvin Evans developed like a perfectly balanced chemical reaction. It was rapid, exothermic, and entirely irreversible. They began sharing a lab. They spoke in the language of molecules, debating the properties of proteins over lunches eaten directly off glass beakers. Calvin didn't want a submissive housewife, he wanted an equal. And Elizabeth found in Calvin a man who respected her mind without reservation. You see, cooking is a chore, Elizabeth told him one evening at her apartment, where she had converted her kitchen into a secondary laboratory, complete with a Bunsen burner on the stove. But cooking is simply chemistry. When you bake bread, you are witnessing the yeast fermenting sugars to produce carbon dioxide and ethanol. When you sear a steak, it's the Maillard reaction, a chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that gives browned food its desirable flavor. Calvin smiled, watching her measure out sodium chloride, salt with a precise digital scale. You make a pot roast sound like a Nobel Prize thesis, Elizabeth. Because it is, Calvin. Society devalues the kitchen because women dominate it, but it is a place of profound scientific transformation. They moved in together, defying the strict societal morals of the early 1960s. They refused to marry. Elizabeth did not want to lose her legal identity or her name to a man, and Calvin respected her independence too much to demand it. They bought a dog, a remarkably intelligent mixed breed that Elizabeth named 6:30, because that was the exact time he woke up every morning. For a brief period, Elizabeth's life was in perfect equilibrium. She had love, she had research, and she had a partner who believed in her genius. But equilibrium in chemistry is fragile, easily disrupted by a sudden change in pressure. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Calvin went out for his daily run with 6:30. A sudden storm had made the road slick. A speeding delivery truck rounded a blind corner. 6:30 barked a frantic warning, pulling at his leash, but it was too late. The impact was instantaneous. Calvin Evans was gone. Chapter 3. Precipitate and Fallout. The grief was a physical weight, a heavy isotope crushing Elizabeth's chest. But the world gave her no time to mourn. Within days of Calvin's death, the administration at Hastings moved to strip Elizabeth of her research. Without Calvin's protective status, the board saw her as expendable. To make matters worse, Elizabeth discovered something that defied her meticulous planning: she was pregnant. When the head of the institute, Drive Donati, found out, he used it as the ultimate leverage. An unmarried, pregnant woman in a professional laboratory is a moral liability, Miss Zott, Donati said, hiding his smug satisfaction behind a veneer of bureaucratic concern. We are terminating your employment. Effective immediately. My research on abiogenesis belongs to me, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking but her eyes like flint. Calvin and I developed those protocols. Hastings funded it. The notes stay here, Donati countered. Good luck, Miss Zott. I hear the department stores are hiring wrappers for the holiday season. Elizabeth walked out of Hastings with her head held high, 6:30 walking faithfully by her side, and a cardboard box containing her few personal belongings. Months later, her daughter was born. Elizabeth named her Madeline, a child who inherited her mother's sharp intellect and her father's intense curiosity. Money was tight. Elizabeth earned a meager living by secretly grading papers for male professors who paid her pennies on the dollar while taking credit for her corrections. By the time Madeline was an inquisitive 5-year-old, Elizabeth knew she needed a stable income. The world was actively trying to starve her out for refusing to conform. The turning point came when Madeline complained about a boy at school stealing her lunches. Elizabeth, who packed lunches with calculated nutritional density and perfectly balanced macronutrients, marched to the school to confront the boy's father. The father happened to be Walter Pine, a stressed television producer for the local network, KPTT. Your daughter's lunch is a culinary and nutritional masterpiece, Walter groaned, holding his head in his hands as Elizabeth confronted him in his office. My daughter loves it. Look, Miss Zott, I'm desperate. The host of our afternoon cooking show just quit. You're assertive, you clearly know how to prepare food, and you look great. Do you want a job? Elizabeth looked at the man, then looked at her bank account balance in her mind. I am a chemist, Elizabeth said firmly. If I accept this position, I will not play a character. I will not wear a frilly apron, and I will not pretend that cooking is magic. It is science. Walter, desperate to fill the time slot, nodded rapidly. Sure, fine, whatever you want. Just start on Monday. Chapter 4. Supper at 6. The set of Supper at 6 was designed to look like a hyper-feminine, idealized 1950s kitchen. There were pastel pink cabinets, fake flowers, and a cheesy theme song. On the first day of the live broadcast, the studio executives expected Elizabeth to walk out, smile at the camera, and teach housewives how to make a quick gelatin salad. Instead, Elizabeth Zott walked out wearing a stark white lab coat over her dress, a sharp No. 2 pencil thrust into her hair bun. She walked past the decorative props, picked up a heavy cast iron skillet, and looked directly into the camera lens. Good afternoon, Elizabeth said, her voice calm, serious, and utterly commanding. Today, we are going to examine the chemical degradation of sucrose, commonly known as caramelization. Many cookbooks tell you to just watch the sugar turn brown. That is unscientific. We will be controlling the temperature precisely to ensure the thermal decomposition of the carbohydrates yields the optimal flavor profile. In the control room, Walter Pine panicked. What is she doing? Where is the smile? But in thousands of living rooms across Southern California, women sat down. They put down their knitting. They turned off their vacuums. A woman was speaking to them from the television, not as if they were simpletons, but as if they were capable of understanding organic chemistry. Now, take your sodium chloride, Elizabeth continued, holding up a salt shaker. We add this to accelerate the breakdown of proteins. Children, if you are watching, take note, everything in this world is chemistry. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. By the end of the week, the station was flooded with letters. The executives were furious. She's not giving them recipes. The station owner, Mr. Lebensmal, screamed at Walter. She's talking about molecular bonds. She told a woman yesterday that a low-carbohydrate diet without proper metabolic understanding is an exercise in futility. Make her look pretty and make her bake a pie. But Walter pointed to the ratings. They were skyrocketing. Women loved Elizabeth Zott. She didn't talk down to them. When she explained how to clean a skillet using the polarity of soap molecules, she gave them a sense of mastery over their environment. She treated their daily labor, the unpaid, unappreciated work of managing a household, with the dignity of a laboratory science. Chapter 5. The Molecular Chain Reaction. Within months, supper at 6 became a national phenomenon. Elizabeth Zott was a household name. Yet, she refused to compromise. When a major sponsor, a canned soup company, demanded she promote their product on air, Elizabeth read the ingredient list live on television. This product contains excessive quantities of sodium, artificial preservatives, and hydrogenated oils, Elizabeth said, holding the can with a pair of laboratory tongs. It is designed for shelf life, not human life. I cannot recommend you feed this chemical soup to your families. Instead, we will make our own bone broth, extracting the natural collagen through a sustained simmer. The sponsor pulled their funding immediately, but 3 other organic food companies lined up to take their place. Elizabeth was untouchable because her audience was fiercely loyal. Her show became more than a cooking program, it became a subterranean movement. Elizabeth began ending her shows with a standard sign-off that resonated deep within the cultural psyche of the decade. Greater than, children, set the table. Your mother needs a moment to think. Women, remember that you are capable of transforming your environment. Do not allow yourselves to be classified by an outdated social system. Good night. Greater than, women began going back to college. Housewives started reading chemistry textbooks. Elizabeth received letters from women who had left abusive marriages, started businesses, or finally demanded their husbands' help with the domestic workload. She had started a chain reaction, and the established social order was beginning to fracture. One afternoon, a high-profile reporter from a national magazine came to interview her. The reporter, a man looking for a patronizing angle, asked, "Miss Zott, aren't you just a frustrated housewife who found a gimmick?" Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "I am a chemist who was denied her rightful place in the laboratory because of systemic misogyny. I am using this television station as a classroom because the universities are too cowardly to let a woman teach. There is no gimmick, there is only truth." Chapter 6. Completing the synthesis. As Madeline grew older, she became the anchor of Elizabeth's world. Together with 630, they formed an unconventional but fiercely loving family. Elizabeth never forgot Calvin. His memory was kept alive in the rigor with which she approached life and the love she poured into their daughter. The ultimate victory came 5 years after Elizabeth first walked onto the set of Supper at 6. A major philanthropic foundation, having discovered the illegal theft of Elizabeth's early research by the Hastings Institute, intervened. It was revealed that Dr. Donati had published Elizabeth's papers on abiogenesis under his own name, winning accolades while her work languished in his stolen files. The scandal ruined Hastings' reputation, and the board was forced to step down. The new donors of the institute had one non-negotiable condition for their multi-million-dollar endowment: Elizabeth Zott must be brought back as the director of chemistry. On her final broadcast of Supper at 6, Elizabeth did not cook. She stood before the cameras in her white lab coat, holding a glass beaker of water. "For 5 years, we have explored the chemistry of nutrition together," she said to millions of weeping viewers. "But my true laboratory calls me back. I am returning to full-time research. I leave you with this final lesson. In chemistry, as in life, change is the only constant. When an environment becomes toxic, you must introduce a catalyst to alter the reaction. You are that catalyst. Do not let the world tell you what you can and cannot achieve." She put down the beaker, smiled a rare, brilliant smile, and walked off the set. The next morning at exactly 6:30, Elizabeth Zott woke up. She made a perfectly balanced cup of coffee, walked into the newly reorganized, state-of-the-art laboratory at the institute, and looked at the blackboard. She picked up a piece of chalk and began to write an equation. She was home, the reaction was complete, and the future was wide open. How to use this story structure. Since this covers the full narrative arc of the book series in a structured format, we can expand any of these chapters into a much longer format if you wish to build towards your goal. Would you like me to deeply expand one of these specific chapters with more dialogue and detailed scenes, or explore a different storyline?